Fellow Falcoholics, what is up? Welcome to another episode of the Dirty Birds and Brews podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Knight at Falcoholic. Kevin here to bring you what might be the last free agency focused show here in a little bit. We're going to go full steam ahead into the draft, obviously, going forward. The Falcons may or may not make any additional moves, and that's sort of the point of this episode is sort of looking at where are the remaining needs, right? The remaining targets, the spots that the Falcons could still look to sign guys. There certainly are some holes. I mean, I really liked what the Falcons did in free agency, and this will sort of be an opportunity for me to also give my overall thoughts on sort of where the team is landing now after they've made, the first 2 weeks or so of signings. So we'll get into it. We'll get into all that. We'll get into some of the top free agents available and if the Falcons might have any interest in those guys, and we'll go from there. But before we do, guys, want to thank everyone for following us over to the Dirty Birds and Brews podcast. It's the same feed, so you don't have to follow us very far, but we do appreciate everyone hanging out there. We appreciate everyone leaving 5-star reviews if you're listening to the audio on whatever platform you prefer. If you have any issues getting this on your chosen platform, please let me know so that I can figure it out. I do believe it is showing up on Google Podcasts now, finally. Hopefully there won't be any more issues going forward, but you never know. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe, hit that bell button, all that good stuff. And since the podcast is now completely owned and operated by me, it's up to me who advertises on this show. So if you're interested, we've actually already had some interested parties, so shout out to you guys that have reached out. But if you are interested, we're getting the ball rolling on that to potentially start either in April or in May with our first campaigns. So if you're interested in advertising on the show, maybe you're a local Atlanta area business or an online business that wants to appeal to very passionate football fan base who would probably also be very thankful to you for advertising on the show like I would be. So hit me up, falcoholiclive@gmail.com if you're interested in talking it out. Obviously breweries, that sort of thing too, because we're going to be doing segments here on our favorite craft brews as well. So thanks a lot for your interest. Definitely hit me up at that email address if you are interested. So for now, let's get on to the pod, talking, of course, about the top remaining targets for the Falcons in free agency. They addressed one of the biggest ones right before Wednesday's show on Falcoholic Live, where they re-signed swing tackle Germain Ifedi, and that does plug one of, I think, the biggest remaining holes that was very obvious. And I do like the Ifedi re-signing. We didn't actually get to see him play, thanks to some very good health by Jake Matthews and Caleb McGarry, and of course we're still hoping that will continue. But it's always nice to have the veteran insurance behind them, and Germain Ifedi, for as sort of strange as his last season in Chicago was, Ifedi has basically been a solid starter or better in basically every stop he's had. He frequently has started a lot of games at right tackle. And he's a good pass protector. The run blocking hasn't been something that he's been particularly good at in his career, but I think the Falcons, like they coached up basically everybody on the roster last year, would have a good chance of getting his blocking to at least a serviceable level on this offensive line, especially next to Chris Lindstrom, who also got a monster extension. So I think swing tackle's fine. The spot that hasn't really been addressed is left guard, and that I think is one that is surprising for a lot of people, me as well, that we haven't really seen any significant signings to solidify that spot. That could mean a number of things. It could mean that they're negotiating with people, and they're sort of interested in somebody that hasn't either broken free yet or they just haven't closed the deal quite yet. But it could also mean that they're waiting to see if they can potentially grab someone in the draft. It could also be that they're, have an offer out to Elijah Wilkinson, much like they did perhaps to Germain Ifedi, and they're waiting to see if Wilkinson decides to come back or not. Either way, they do have some options there, in-house options. I don't think many of them are very inspiring to Falcons fans, right? Matt Hennessy, probably the one that is the favorite, I would say right now, to be left guard. And to be fair to him, I think he was solid when he did have to step in at left guard. I don't think he was as good as Elijah Wilkinson, but he definitely was a good run blocker, so there's that. There's also Justin Schaefer, last year's day 3 addition, who didn't really get an opportunity to play or get off the practice squad much at all. And then, of course, Jalen Mayfield's still kicking around, right? Who spent basically the entire season on injured reserve, so we don't really know what's going on with Mayfield, but he's a former third-round pick. You would think he would at least be in the mix for that battle, so it's possible that they like that group they have there. They also signed Kyle Hinton to a reserve future contract, so maybe they're sort of satisfied with, like, let's see if one of these guys shakes out. Tyler Vrabel, the undrafted tackle, he also potentially could play guard, so I think I'm still expecting we'll see some sort of like starter level signing here, but it may be after the draft, and it may be that they end up drafting someone to be that sort of starter. And if they don't draft someone, we could see the signing happen after the draft. So that's sort of, it could happen at any time. I think left guard is probably the most likely spot other than wide receiver that we could see another signing before the draft. But, it could also be after, and they could just be waiting patiently, right, to see if somebody breaks free that they're interested in, or, they're wanting to test out all of these young players that they've brought in and see if somebody can stake a claim to the spot that they haven't so far. But it's another year of experience under all these guys' belts, and maybe somebody can improve. And, to give props to Dwayne Ledford, like pretty much everyone on that offensive line did improve from their 2021 version. So maybe there is something to be said about taking that approach, and then if you still need to go out and get someone, you do it at final cuts and figure out someone who shakes loose and bring him in and go from there, or trade, a la the Andy Lee retrade situation for that, make that happen. If they have the cap space, they probably would be able to have the flexibility to do something like that. So we talked about swing tackle, left guard, wide receivers is the other one that's probably the most likely place we would see a signing before the draft, just because it's pretty barren still. We got Drake London, which is awesome. We got Matt Hollins, who I do like, and I think that the team is more or less comfortable with him being like the second receiver right now. He's probably going to be more like the fourth or fifth target in the passing game, so they're not as necessarily concerned with him being like a wide receiver 2 or something like that. But I think they would still obviously like to get more depth and more options in that room. We still have Jared Bernhardt, who missed the tail end of the season on IR. Frank Darby returns, and a couple of UDFA types in Rashawn Henry and Josh Ali. Not really anyone instilling a lot of confidence there, as more of like back end roster type guys at this point. But, in free agency, the wide receiver market has been, it's been pretty picked over. DJ Shark was one I think that a lot of people were interested in. He just signed with the Panthers on Friday. There are still guys out there that they could look at. Kenny Golladay hasn't played well, but he's probably not going to be very expensive at this point, considering he's still on the market. I think they could go and re-sign Olamide Zaccheaus. They might be waiting for that until after the draft. Sammy Watkins, for as much as he hasn't lived up to that elite hype, still like a solid receiver, would seemingly fit what the Falcons are trying to do here. If they're looking for speed, like a Brashad Perriman, another UCF legend, could come in. Marquise Goodwin was another guy that I was somewhat interested in, but he did just sign elsewhere. And then, of course, the Falcons could just go back to some of their depth guys after the draft if they don't get what they want, right? They could try to get Damiere Byrd back. They could re-sign Kaderil Hodge to be that special teams guy. So they do have some options. There's still some interesting depth receivers out there, but I honestly think they're waiting to see what happens with Corey Davis before they do anything else at wide receiver. Arthur Smith, loved Corey Davis. Corey Davis had a career year under Smith, almost 1,000 yards. He obviously fits this offense really well, has a lot of experience in it. So, and something's going to happen with Corey Davis soon. I don't know if he's going to be part of the trade compensation with Aaron Rodgers back to the Packers. His contract is pretty expensive, so it's like maybe the Packers actually don't want that. So he's either going to be traded as a part of that deal, or he's going to be cut. And if he is cut, the Falcons, I think, would try to swoop in and pick him up. And I think they would have an excellent chance, of course, of landing him thanks to the Arthur Smith connection. But that's my thought on why we haven't seen anything else happen at wide receiver, is that they're sort of waiting to see what happens with Corey Davis. And, once that's resolved, they'll either get him or they won't. And I think regardless of what happens with Corey Davis, they'll probably sign one more veteran starter and then draft somebody, and that'll be the receiver room for the most part. And they'll definitely bring in undrafted guys and other stuff like that, like they do every year, and maybe somebody impresses there too. But I don't think they're going to overly rely on that. So that's sort of the offensive spots. The other one that I do definitely want to touch on, though, is running back, which we've seen the running back market be like super quiet. Like nobody's really gotten money except for like Miles Sanders, which is kind of funny. But it's a good market. Like I think there's a lot of options out there. The Falcons could bring in for limited amounts of money. Not really, they could bring in sort of a reserve guy and not owe them a ton. Like Darrell Henderson, for instance, he's out there. I think he would be pretty cheap, and I think he would be a pretty good, reserve behind what the Falcons already have. Jerick McKinnon of the Chiefs, I like a lot as sort of that mix-it-up option. Darrell Williams of the Cardinals, I liked him a lot coming out. Like, there's a lot of guys, and I don't think any of them will be expensive. Again, this may be something where the Falcons are sort of content to just, wait. Until the draft, see if they get somebody they like in the draft, and if they don't, they'll just sign a veteran. We've seen them do this frequently. So I don't necessarily think it's coming, imminently or it's even particularly likely before the draft, but I do think they'll make at least one more significant addition at running back and then sort of be content to see if they can bring in some UDFA types and see if any of their other guys, sort of shake out. Because with Caleb Huntley's health sort of a big question mark, you don't really know. Like, if Huntley's healthy for the start of the season, then I think, you're pretty comfortable with Algier, Huntley, Patterson, Williams as your, nominal four. Williams is sort of like a quasi running back, so maybe you want somebody else on the practice squad close by. But if Huntley's not healthy, then they do need somebody else. And running back is one of the more volatile positions due to injuries, so I don't think you want to take too many chances with if you have one injury where you're down to one real running back, and then you have Avery Williams, who I think could be a decent change of pace guy, but not someone you're giving a bunch of carries to. So that's the offensive side of the ball. I didn't really mention a ton of the free agents. At guard, if the Falcons want to go out and pay guys, Dalton Reisner is probably the name that most are going to bring up, and I would be open to that if they don't get Elijah Wilkinson back for cheaper money. So that's probably where my focus would be, on someone like Reisner, who I liked a lot coming out as well. He does have that tackle flexibility too, I think. But yeah, I wouldn't be upset with Reisner, certainly. Moving over to the defense, the one spot that they really haven't, there's two spots really that they haven't really addressed. And that would be the edge, right? But they did re-sign Lorenzo Carter, but there's still room for a big time edge rusher addition. Seems like that's not going to happen in free agency, but and then linebacker, where they haven't really added anything other than they did add Caden Ellis, right? And I guess the big question is he going to be more off ball, or is he going to be more of that edge player? And if he's off ball, then I think linebacker's not that big a deal, because you're probably going to get Troy Anderson and Caden Ellis as your two linebackers on 90% of plays. If Ellis is playing more edge, then maybe the edge thing is lower down the list and you need another off-ball guy. So they could get a linebacker. I mean, linebackers they're out there. They're going to be available, so they don't really need to rush it. Nick Kwiatkowski, I feel like they signed right before camp, and he probably could have been a solid starter for them. They didn't ever really need to call on him, but so I think they're probably going to be patient at linebacker. At edge, to me, it seems like they're waiting to see what happens with Calais Campbell, who, he's going to play more of a base end role on early downs and then kick inside. I think they would love to get somebody like Campbell in here because they're really sort of missing that big 5-tech run stuffer, and they're missing that Cam Jordan type that can reduce inside. So I do think that they would like to see if Campbell would come here. I think we would all like that. But if they do miss on Campbell, that they have some other options, Jadeveon Clowney is out there, as silly as that would be, Dave Choate finally being right about Clowney coming to Atlanta. Shout out to Dave, by the way. It's, he hasn't been nearly as good as people have been hoping for, but the price might be right now to get Clowney, where it's before he was just not living up to the contract. It was still a solid player. Now might be if he's a $5 million player, that might be more what he is playing at, and that's actually a good deal now. So We'll see what happens there. Leonard Floyd, probably a higher end option, but again, it's like I don't know if they want. I feel like Floyd and Lorenzo Carter kind of are filling a similar role. It just depends on like, do they want to go more hand in the dirt or do they want the more stand up guys? And I don't really know at this point for that last spot. But edge is a little bit more crowded, I think, than people realize, where they've got 3 guys that are roster locks right now with Lorenzo Carter, Arnold Ebiketie, and D'Angelo Malone, and they're probably only keeping 5 edge rushers at most. So if they draft someone, that's 4. And that means none of your other, guys are going to make the roster, which is fine. Like, I mean, I do like David Aneni. Shout out friend of the show, David Aneni, Quentin Bell, and then they have Amani Bledsoe, who is sort of that big end type of guy right now. None of those guys you're like, oh, they need a reserved roster spot. But they don't have room to make like 2 or 3 edge additions like some people are saying. It's probably going to be one more veteran and then a draft pick. They might be waiting. I think they're going to see what happens with Campbell. Who's going to also play a lot on the inside, and then probably try to draft someone, and then depending on what happens there, we'll see if they make another veteran addition, if they don't get, the edge as high as they wanted. But this is a deep edge class. We've seen edge at 8, we've seen edge at 44, we've seen edge, all throughout the draft, all the way up until like the 5th round. You can get sort of at least potential starters with how deep this group is. So that's one that they may sort of wait and see if they sort of strike out on Campbell, if he was the guy they want, and then wait and see who's still available later, or they make a move or a trade. If they keep a lot of cap space in reserve, they're going to be very flexible to be able to trade for other veterans that other teams might want to offload later in the process. And that's sort of something I want to emphasize, is that it doesn't all have to happen right now. They may want to hold on to the cap space, be a little bit more patient, and see who shakes loose later, when there might be more opportunities that present themselves. You don't necessarily have to go all in on the free agents available right now, because that's going to change over time. The defensive interior I actually think is in pretty good shape. If Campbell signs, then it's in really good shape. I really don't think there's going to be another addition if Campbell signs after that. And the reason is they've got Grady Jarrett. They've got David Onyemata, that's your 2, passing down starters right there. Eddie Goldman got reinstated. That's probably your nose tackle, assuming he plays. And then they have Taquan Graham, who I think is probably going to be your first guy off the bench, who was actually good, like really good in that role last year. And I think that's a perfect role for him. He's probably going to really excel there. And then they have a couple of guys who I think are perfectly good, like 4th, 5th defensive tackle types, like 5th defensive tackle types. Because right now they have 4 guys that I would if Eddie Goldman is going to play, I sort of think he's more or less close to a roster lock, like if he's healthy and ready to play, because he's a much better nose tackle than Timmy Horn at this stage. Maybe Timmy Horn can get there, but I don't think he's really competing on a serious level with Eddie Goldman, assuming Goldman's, somewhat back to his former self. And then Jalen Dalton, who I think is somebody that this coaching staff likes and is likely to stick around with Ryan Nielsen. So there's not really a lot of room, especially if Calais Campbell signs, because then they'll have 5 guys: Graham, Jarrett, Goldman, Onyemata, and Campbell. And then there's not room for anyone. So that group is probably more set than people think. That doesn't mean they can't draft like a Jalen Carter or like a Adebare, in the 2nd round or whatever, if they do miss on Campbell. But I think once Campbell signs, if he does, then it's probably pretty settled on the interior here. Cornerback is one where it's sort of up in the air what the plan is. They did sign Mike Hughes to like a starting caliber, like a low end starter contract. And his comments seem to suggest that they wanted to play him in the slot. I wouldn't take that as like total, fact at this point. I think that they probably are going to start him there based on those comments, but Mike Hughes has played pretty well on the outside too. They may like his versatility and his special teams ability. So really, I think right now your starters are probably AJ Terrell, Casey Hayward, and Mike Hughes. And I think that they would consider adding a top corner at 8. I think they would consider adding a corner on day 2 as well, to sort of mix into that group. But I don't think there's a lot more room there. Like, it's getting a little bit crowded because you've got D. Alford, who I think you'd probably like to keep around. I think he's showed enough. And then you have Darren Hall as well, who, was drafted by the previous defensive coordinator. So, how well does he fit what Ryan Nielsen and Jerry Gray are doing? I don't know, but I think he's likely to stick around if they don't make any huge moves. And then a couple of sort of UDFA types there. And then safety, I think they have room for like one more guy. I don't know if they need to go out and sign someone at this point. I think they'll probably wait to see if somebody falls to them in the draft that they like in my draft on Friday with them taking Antonio Johnson. I think they visited with like Jamie Robinson from FSU. I think they're looking for like a box big nickel type guy. So, if they find that big nickel starter in the draft, that's fine. They also visited with like Trey Flowers, who's a similar type of player in free agency. So if they sign him, that's another option there. Right now, but I think the depth there is fine. Like they have Jesse Bates, they have Richie Grant, they have Jalen Hawkins, and then some other guys. But again, not really a spot that's like a screaming need at this point. So just sort of recap. Right now, I think the big needs are like edge, left guard, wide receiver, and then getting one more cornerback I think is important. Getting a potential RB2 if Caleb Huntley is not healthy. That's important. And then, we didn't really talk about quarterback or tight end. And of course, you can always upgrade your quarterback room. They may decide to take a swing at somebody if somebody they like is there. I don't really think that's likely that a rookie comes in, to be honest with you. Tight end, this regime is obsessed with tight ends. They did trade for Jonnu Smith. So, and I imagine they want to see at least what they have in John Fitzpatrick. I do wonder if that's why Michael Pruitt hasn't returned yet. But I do think that Michael Pruitt should be on speed dial. Like if they don't add a tight end in the draft, which I'm here to tell you that they could add a tight end anytime because that's how much this regime loves tight ends. So I think they may be like, we're going to see if we get somebody we like at some point in the draft, or we can maybe bring back Michael Pruitt. But right now it's a pretty crowded room because Felipe Franks is in there, and I know he's sort of a meme to some people, but the Falcons kept 5 tight ends for most of the season on the roster. So right now they only have 5 tight ends: Kyle Pitts, Jonnu Smith, Parker Hesse, Felipe Franks, and John Fitzpatrick. So there's going to be more tight ends brought in just to fill out the camp roster because they're going to use a lot of tight ends. So technically they have John Rain too, who I have listed more as a fullback, but with Clint Rakovich coming in, another fullback to compete, they may move Rain back more to the tight end side. We'll see. But yeah, I think like the depth of the roster has improved a lot. I think all of the positions are deeper except for wide receiver at this point. And I think that, you're pretty happy with how free agency has played out. I mean, I certainly am. I think it's there's been some pretty nitpicky stuff put out there about like, they overpaid for Chris Lindstrom, which is ridiculous. I don't think you can overpay the best player at their position. I don't think you ever let that guy leave. He's young too. So like, I just don't get that. I think there's a lot of gnashing of teeth over the team not pursuing Lamar Jackson, but no one's pursuing Lamar Jackson. So don't direct your ire at the Falcons. Direct your ire at the NFL for whatever the heck they're doing with Lamar Jackson. I don't understand it. You don't understand it. Nobody understands it. Maybe they get back in at some point. I don't really think that they will. Somebody probably will. But, at this point, nobody's going after Lamar Jackson. So that doesn't seem like it's really an option. They seem, at least based on Taylor Heineke's comments, to believe that Ritter is the starter at this point. So we'll see if that plays out. I don't think they're going to be interested in moving up in the draft for a quarterback. I don't think they're really going to be interested in taking a quarterback at 8. So I think that's pretty settled. So, overall, I think the roster is in a place where the Falcons are pretty flexible, and we'll definitely talk more about that as we transition to more pure draft stuff going forward. But I think that they have set themselves up like they say they want to, right? Which is we want to draft the best player that we can, and we want to not necessarily box ourselves into drafting for need because we have these giant, holes on our roster. And I think they did a pretty good job of that, as well as you probably can do without really overpaying in free agency for a bunch of guys. I think they've sort of positioned themselves where they need a couple pieces at each spot, but nothing is like a screaming need. I think the biggest one is probably like they need another receiver. But I think the Falcons are probably going to be able to get away with fewer receivers better than just about any other team. And all of their free agent wide receivers are still out there on the market with, Zacchaeus and Kaderil Hodge and Demir Bird. So those guys could easily come back too. So I think the plan right now is patience, maybe a few signings before the draft if guys shake loose or guys like Corey Davis, end up getting released or whatever. I don't think we're going to get a lot more moves because there's honestly not a lot of room. Now they can always cut guys, right? I mean, that's always an option, but like the Falcons are already pretty full. Like they have 72 players under contract as of the time I'm recording this podcast. That could obviously change by the time you listen to this, but that means, for those that don't know, you can have 90 players on your offseason roster. There's only 18 spots left. 7 of those are going to be draft picks. So that leaves 11 spots for free agents and undrafted free agents. And this team has typically liked to bring in a lot of undrafted free agents. So at this point, I really think we're looking at maybe 3 more veterans coming in before the draft, and then 8 to 10 UDFAs, and they may waive some guys to make room for them. I don't know. But, this probably is not going to be as big of a UDFA class as it has been in years past as a result. But I think that they're going to bring in a lot of those guys. So there's not a lot of space. Obviously, the low end of the roster guys, the guys underneath the top 51 rule especially, like they can freely shift those guys in and out. So they're not like tied to any of those guys necessarily. But I think they like the guys they've brought in. And I think they would ideally, like to at least see them in camp. There's always going to be some shuffling, of course. But at this point, I think we'll see a couple more strategic moves and then wait to see what happens in the draft and then potentially shuffle some more guys in and out of the roster. But the draft at this point, just a little over a month away, guys. We're almost there. I'm excited to get into it. I'm getting a lot of really good NFL draft focused guests lined up, both for the live show and for the podcast. We're going to have Trevor Sikkema from the NFL Stock Exchange podcast coming on at some point. We're going to have my buddies Thor Nystrom from, I believe it's Fantasy Pros now. Don't quote me on that. I'll make sure I have the correct information, Thor, before you come on. Tyler Fornes as well. I'm going to try to get Damian Parsons from the Draft Network as well. So we're going to have a lot of guys come in, get a lot of perspectives in here about the Falcons draft needs and some of our favorite prospects. You guys can look forward to that over the next few weeks. Really excited also to have total control of the pod. No longer have the corporate overlords hanging over my shoulder. That does mean I have to absorb all of the costs myself. So if you're interested in supporting the show, and you have a business, you can advertise with us, falcoholiclive@gmail.com. Email me, or you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/falcoholiclive. If you like to get these episodes a few days early, then you can do that on Patreon. They're also going to be ad-free, of course. And we also have some exclusive stuff like patron Q&A sessions. The next one is going to be Monday night at 6 p.m. Those are exclusive live sessions where we take questions from our patrons for about an hour. We do those frequently. So that's something you can get involved with, and other cool stuff. I'm trying to come up with some more ideas for patron stuff. There's an exclusive Discord channel that we hang out in, the Patron Lounge. So if you want access to the Patron Lounge, hit me up. But I appreciate everyone just for watching, honestly. We do appreciate, obviously, the subscribing and the liking and the clicking of the bell and all that. And, of course, leave those 5-star reviews on your podcast platform of choice, which hopefully this show is available on now. But again, guys, thank you so much for listening to the Dirty Birds and Brews podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Knight, at Falcoholic Kevin. You can follow the show at Falcoholic Live, at Falcoholic Pod. Not changing the at. You can't make me. But guys, thanks again. Check out the Discord, by the way. It's in the picture right there. It's also in the show description if you want to chat with a bunch of fellow Falcons fans. I think we're over 500 in there now, so it's getting a little rowdy. So come on in for some good times. And yeah, we'll be back in a couple days to have our next Falcoholic Live recording Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Check us out there if you haven't seen that yet. It's a lot of fun. I believe we'll be joined by Aaron Freeman on Wednesday to get his takes on free agency and the upcoming NFL draft for our beloved Atlanta Falcons. So until next time, guys, I'm Kevin Knight. Have a great day, folks.